Welcome to Somewhere Partially Underground on this continent. This morning, I'm going to be doing a teaching in a series entitled Spiritual Warfare. This is part 3, and I entitled it Personal. Matthew chapter 4. I'm going to start with verse 1. Then Jesus was led of the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil. And when he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he was afterward hungry. And when Satan came to him, he said, If thou be the Son of God, command that these stones be made bread. And Jesus answered and said, It is written, Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. Then the devil taketh him up into the holy city, and setteth him on the pinnacle of the temple, and said, If thou be the Son of God, cast thyself down. For it is written, He shall give his angels charge concerning thee, and in their hands they shall bear thee up, at least at any time, that thou dash thy foot against a stone. And Jesus answered him and said, It is written, Thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God. On this channel, I have a teaching entitled Who, Not What. It's about the Garden of Eden. It's about a view from the Hebrew word that's translated a lot of times serpent is more like the shining one, and I go into details on that. Adam and Eve handed the title deed of the earth, or as Charles Capps likes to say, the earth lease to Satan. Adam and Eve had a personal encounter with Satan, and they lost. They let Satan change the meaning of words. Genesis 3:1. Here in these verses is the greatest showdown in the history of the world, in sports and military. One-on-one, both sides play all their cards. They throw it all in the middle of the table. It was not about machines or machines of war. It was a war of words. 3 times Satan tries to trick Jesus. Verse 3 here in Matthew 4 was over food and misquoting Deuteronomy 8:3. Verse 5 was about safety. Psalm 91:11 he was misquoting. And then verse 9 was about worship. And he was misquoting Isaiah 14:14. So, Jesus' answer was about the food. He quoted the Holy Torah, Deuteronomy 8:4. Verse 7, about safety, he's quoting Deuteronomy 6:16. In verse 10 about worship, he's quoting Jesus, quoting 6:13. Jesus was there when Satan and some of the angels fell. Luke 10:18, Isaiah 14:12, Revelation 12:4. And Jesus was at the beginning, Genesis 1:26, John 1:1 through 3. Let's look at Job chapter 1, verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. What was this? Is there some kind of courtroom in heaven? Is this like a UN? Because even the UN that we have has some very horrible human beings that come to present their case. 1 Kings 22. 1 Kings chapter 22. Let's turn there. Verse 21. And there came forth a spirit and stood before the Lord. And the Lord said, and told the Lord, I will persuade him. I have a teaching, a lying spirit and lying prophets. We're going into detail on this chapter. So here we have these 3 situations, the Garden of Eden, Genesis 3:1, maybe BC 4004 if you believe in a young earth theory like I do, and Ken Ham and some other people, Creation Research Institute. Job 1:6, about 1520, about 2,484 years after the garden, and then in the 1 Kings 22:21, in about a BC 897, 623 years after Job. So here in the history of the world, of these close encounters of the third kind, or I would call personal encounters. There are times in your personal spiritual warfare that you don't win. 1 Kings 19:4. But Elijah went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree and requested for himself to the Lord that he might die. And the Lord, take away my life. And so here we have the great prophet Elijah, who prayed for the rain to stop. And then he prayed for the rain to start. 1 Kings 17:1, 1 Kings 18:1. And James in 5:17-18 recounts this. In 1 Kings 18:38, the miracle of fire from heaven in the great contest with the prophets of Baal, 1 Kings 18:25. Elijah bold in facing the prophets of Baal, 1 Kings 18:21. And to Ahab, 1 Kings 18:17, who did more evil than all the kings before, 1 Kings 16:30. Elijah's bold. Now, there's this process that we go through of high being high, low being low. If you tend to get really excited about things, it's going to spring back like a pendulum and be real low. There was a pastor that I had a million years ago, probably the 80s. And I actually got to preach in that church even more than some of the pastors were on staff. He was had a credential, had a master's in psychology. His son had a master's in psychology on staff. And they tried to teach the people, and they weren't real Pentecostal chandelier swinging. They tried to keep people from that because, okay, just if it's good, just kind of go here. If it's slow, okay, don't go really to the bottom of the pit. The great football coach, Tom Osborne at Nebraska University, was that way. Early on, he had great seasons, but couldn't, quote, win the big one. And yet, through the course of the years, even when he finally won the big one, it was like that. He was trying to keep his emotions, or just his natural personality. In 19:2, then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So let the gods do to me and more also, if I make not thy life as one of them by tomorrow about this time." Or in other words, I'm going to whack you, Elijah. And that's what drove Elijah to what he did. The Queen Jezebel, on a comedy, one of the characters in this comedy was calling someone Jezebel Johnson. And I heard that phrase as a kid. And it was an insult. You were insulting someone. And in deliverance ministry, which is the ministry of casting out demons, it's a big debate about what's what in this whole thing. There's a demon named after Jezebel. What's something to be remembered for, huh? Revelation 2:20. The commentary on the spirit of Jezebel, demonic force, power and control, and other things. And Elijah felt more demonic power off of her than Ahab. what Elijah felt after several great hard battles. Was fear. In The Lord of the Rings, the third one, the horsemen are trying to save a castle and they're fighting and they're barely winning, but it looks like they might pull this thing out. And all of a sudden you hear a horn, and in the distance are these giant elephants and soldiers coming at them. And the king is just there. Oh, no, no. But then he pulls himself out of his depression and he says, okay, there's only one way to survive this. So he has his horn being played and just says, regroup and recalculate this thing and go into them. That's the only chance to survive this thing. And in 2 Kings 9:36, Elijah did regroup. Matthew chapter 17, we'll read verse 14. And when they came to the multitude, there came a certain man kneeling down to Jesus and saying, Lord, have mercy on me. My son, he is a lunatic, and he's sore vexed. For oftentimes he falleth into the fire and oft into the water. I brought him to thy disciples, and they could not cure him. And Jesus answered and said, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him to me. In Luke 9:1, Jesus gave a power and authority over demons. In 28 AD, in Luke 9:1, this was done. In AD 29, I've got my pen here. AD of 29, the Great Transfiguration, where the inner three of the disciples got to see the glory of God, of Jesus, of his nature, of his God nature, the hypostatic union, fully God, fully man. And they got to feel and see the presence of his glory. And then these verses here are later in AD 29. They had these great experiences, these great victories, yet they were failures in this personal encounters of the third kind. Why? Why could they not regroup and go forward? Let's look at 17 and 18. And Jesus talks about faithless and perverse generations. Commentary on this says that faithless is to disciples, or unbelief to the disciples, faithless, and perverse or corrupt to the crowds. But Jesus only had 3 years to impart, and so we can't expect everything in those 3 years. And you read the end of John and you see why. Verse 19, the disciples came to Jesus, and why couldn't we do it? And Jesus says, verse 20, because of your unbelief. This Greek word here is apostia, and it's in the word family of pistis, which is faith, translated faith, believe. Faithless, disbelieving, absolutely no faith, untrustworthy, absolutely don't believe. And then in verse 20, he talks about if you have faith, pistis. And these are related because in the same word group, but one is the opposite of the other. Acts 16. Okay, let's read in verse 18. And then she many days, but Paul, being grieved, turned and said, in the name of Jesus, I command you to come out of her. Now, this is I have a sermon on this in this YouTube teaching. Don't have enough time for all this notes. On another channel, the Mass Preacher, Orthomanteo, Orthotomeo, Python, the Strangler. Because this word here in verse 16, divination, is pathanos, this Greek word here. So, Paul was another group wanted to travel with him, and it took him a few days for the gift of discerning of demons, spirits to take hold, and some of you he just wasn't catching it. But in verse 21 of Matthew, as I conclude, howbeit this kind goeth not out, but by prayer and fasting. And so, this is a word for all of us about when we have these spiritual encounters. In Mark 6:46, Jesus goes off to pray by himself. Jesus fasted before he went to fight with Satan. There is a place and time to prepare. If you're going to go into a situation with someone high up in a religious cult or where you know there's going to be some very serious demonic interference in confrontations and close encounters of the third kind, you need to really spend some time in prayer. I mean, hours of praying and time fasting and saying, Lord, prepare me. Give me a word for this battle. But they didn't have the faith. They had a faith to a certain level. And that's part of the Christian life. We have faith to a certain level, and then we like hit a wall, or we just run in fear because we're terrified of what the next encounter is going to be. And until the time that we go to be with the Lord, if you're a young believer and you haven't been around very long, that's these verses. Take this teaching, go really slow, go through it once, get the feeling of it, then come back and go slow, write a verse, have a Bible, take notes, and look at what you're reading and what God is saying to you about these personal encounters that we're going to face along the way. Lord, I pray for everyone who views this teaching, that you deal with them and encourage them, Lord, about spiritual warfare and what they need to do to prepare for the encounters that they will face. Signing off from somewhere partially underground.